Good day, everybody. Hope you're doing well. This is the first desktop presentation for Sustainable Engineering class. We're going to cover some background material and go from there. 3 primary learning objectives for this video is the very brief history of sustainability and sustainable engineering, learn some basic definition and framework for sustainable engineering, and for this class, learn basic design principles, how these design principles can be applied. Also, any questions or anything else you want covered, please let me know. I want to ask you to take maybe 30 seconds and write down on a piece of paper or something, how would you, in your own words, define sustainable engineering? So take a few seconds here and see what you can come up with. So I'm giving you one definition of sustainable engineering. I've searched the web over. There's a lot of them having to do with system approaches. There is no right or wrong definition, but just in terms of how we're going to use it for this course, we're going to look at it as an integration of social, environmental, and economic considerations to make a given product, process, or system, or even a decision. This can be done, to be done and applied throughout the life cycle of that given product, process, system, or decision, from the design, decision matrices, production, distribution, implementation, and the lifespan of that product or system. The intent is to minimize the environmental impacts across the entire life cycle, while at the same time maximizing the benefit to society and stakeholders, particularly your clients. So if you wait a second and think about that, that should be a little daunting. It actually is a tall order, but that is the position engineers in the 21st century are put in today. So this is something that we're all going to have to get used to, and we're all going to have to be able to respond to. There is a lot of emphasis in the literature, and we'll emphasize it too in this course, about trade-offs between and synergy between the environment, society, and economic objectives and meeting your clients' needs. What I don't like about what's in the literature is that it is viewed or presented or given a tone that to be sustainable, you got to give something up. And what I'm finding in our practice here with our firm, and a lot of other people are too, is that there's a more synergistic approach to sustainable engineering. It's not always you got to give up something, or you got to pay more for it, or you need to lack potential functionality. But in fact, you can gain functionality, you can decrease costs, you can provide a better service or a better outcome to a client, and have the social and economic benefits. So sometimes trade-offs are necessary, and you got to either pay more or deliver less, but not always. And so I want you to take a kind of a fresh look at this and seeing where can I find win-win situations. Sustainable engineering is kind of broken down into these different categories, and I've given you on the left the engineering perspective, and on the right the biology perspective. So a lot of sustainability courses, departments, whatever, are kind of focused in a life sciences type of program or college versus the engineering perspective. So both of them kind of have a theme of energy into it, energy management. The second theme would probably be environmental. The biologists would call that ecology, but they're really quite similar. Both perspectives have a water resources perspective in terms of managing water and maintaining water. both perspectives have materials. The engineering perspective focuses more on recycling materials or coming up, designing and creating new materials, while the biological perspective focuses more on natural resources and minimizing the impacts or the usage of natural resources. The engineering side will have what we call systems perspective, while the biological perspective would call that biodiversity. And then, of course, the manufacturing side perspective of sustainability from an engineering perspective versus what the biologists would call the biomimicry. So how do I put something together as elegantly, as quickly, and cheaply as possible? So sustainable development is the development defined as meeting the present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So how did we get here? Why are we even talking about sustainability now in 2016? Well, one of the things I hope you understand from these next couple of slides is the sustainability field, or even perspective, or even care of, has really only been around for less than 50 years. Most of it's been around for less than 30 years. So in the big picture, it's quite young. It's quite young in respect to other industries and other sectors. So as a industry or sector, sustainability is much younger. It has bled into, and some people would say this, infecting other industries like our construction industry, like our resource management industry, tourism, material processing, manufacturing, whatever. And sustainability is coming into those industries that have been well around for decades before sustainability was even thought of. And the tendency has been to push back against this young ideas that haven't been proven yet, or haven't even been well developed. So starting in the 1970s is when you first see those first wave of scientific papers that were buried in scientific journals that only academics or research scientists were reading, dealing with the depletion of Earth's resources, and the poor quality of water and land use, and all these other issues that were first being identified by scientists in the early 1970s. As today we talk mostly about the atmosphere and climate change, but this really started off as a waste management problem. We were producing enormous amounts of waste in the 1960s and 70s. Recycling was barely even thought of, and our landfills, or at least the areas we had set aside for landfills, were becoming depleted. And along the same time, you had a lot of urban sprawl here in the U.S., and you had a large growth of population globally as those baby boomers were coming in, becoming adults, and population growth, waste growth, land use changes, significant land use changes across the globe, and it kind of made a head. And so we had to make new landfills, had to make them larger, they were becoming full, because the suburban sprawl, they had to be moved or placed further out, and this became an issue from a municipality perspective. A few years after that was the energy crisis of the mid-1970s, when oil production decreased and price spiked. This was really kind of a shockwave to the large U.S. culture, as well as the European culture, that it made the average everyday person think about natural resources in a way that they really haven't thought of previously. We were very much grow, consume mentality, and now it was hard to find gasoline. Gasoline was very expensive. People couldn't drive as much, and that was really the first time where people actually had to think about these natural resources that we just always assumed. You and most people in the U.S., you go to the bathroom and flush your toilets, it goes away. Nobody really thinks about everything that's got to happen to make your waste in that bowl go away and not have downstream negative effects to other people. That's a lot of infrastructure, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of people working hard every day to make that happen, and often the average person doesn't think about that. And as the planet changes, everybody's going to have to start thinking about that a little bit more. So in the 1980s, a lot of this, so this initial work that was found in the 1970s by some early scientists was being repeated. And so now we have several studies with multiple data sets showing us the same thing regarding our depletion of earth resources and poor quality of other resources such as our land, our air, and our water streams. So a lot of academics and private companies beginning to work on sustainability and how do we come up and manage this. Most of this work was done kind of in private. Companies like Coca-Cola actually developed a sustainability program in the late 1960s, early 70s, but they kind of kept it hush for several years. They took a very hard scientific look at their Coke product and how to make it more sustainable. Municipalities and different government organizations began looking at this. Academics were developing sustainability procedures and protocols and theories in the 1980s. So it was kind of going on behind closed doors, but it was developing. The 1990s is really when sustainability kind of exploded on the map, so to speak. Number one, the media kind of got more a hold of this and started publishing this, to which the average everyday person was starting to hear about sustainability. They were hearing about global warming. They were learning about the poor quality of water in our rivers and streams. Trash was becoming an epidemic issue in certain parts of the planet, and recycling effort starts taking off. So this is really when the field of sustainability becomes real and becomes a own little industry in itself. There were several attempts to by early adapters to create companies, provide services and products to deal with a lot of these natural resource issues over time. So if you're looking at sustainability's growth, this is kind of what I term as the teenage years. You had rapid growth in the markets. As a teenager, it grows a lot of development for teenagers. Pretty much they could live and stand on their own. It became a standalone industry, but it doesn't mean that people knew what they were doing. There are a lot of mistakes. LEED certification was early versions of LEED got a bad rep because of poor quality, but that improved with time. A lot of these sustainability efforts were still developing. And in the early 2000s, the field of sustainability became more mainstream. College and universities now having majors in sustainability. Major corporations were hiring people, having office of sustainability, directors of sustainabilities, and those individuals were actually having a seat at the table and say and how product is developed, how urban planning was accomplishing, where to place a landfill, all these type of issues were beginning to set hold in the early 2000s. Although there are no standards really yet, there were established norms. ISO 14000 was coming out and was beginning to be implemented by many industries and organizations. So it was, again, one step forward, two step back. But there's definitely a sense of urgency. It became much more of a common conversation piece among the average person. And in 2010s, again, growth is continuing. It's slowing down. It's not rapidly growing as much, which is probably good for everybody. The processes and best practices are being redefined based on actual data from some of those early trials in the 1990s and 2000s. So based on real data, based on experience, based on lesson learned, a lot of the new sustainability practices that are being redefined really just within the last 6 years. The causes of human instability are many. Primarily, number one is just overconsumption. We are consuming Earth-made resources at a substantial rate that we cannot replenish. And that's kind of main reason number one. And in fact, if I were to rank these, that'd be reason number 1, 2, and 3. We are just, as a species, we are consuming more than the Earth can handle. Secondly is the combination and polarization of wealth. So again, you have the access to resources is becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer individuals and fewer countries. And so that has set up a global winner and losers, so to speak, table where certain individuals in certain countries have access to a lot of natural resources that others aren't. So this had led to number 3, to economic instabilities. This has led to, if we get to the natural resources and the rare earth metals, particularly how that has been rapidly being mined by companies like the Apple for iPhones and silicone and things like that, how that has had a boom-bust economy for some of these third world countries as people come in, mine for these rare earth metals, take them and leave those particular societies with the mess left behind. You're seeing the same thing actually happening in the Dakotas and Wyoming with a lot of the fracking that was going on. We had a huge economic boom, followed by a slowing down or bust of the drilling that was happening in both Dakotas and Wyoming. This economic instability has led to migration pressures, as well as wars and famines and all these other issues, to where you're having large migrations of peoples going into urban cities, going across political boundaries that are destabilizing different countries and different regions, leading to too much demand on natural resources that cannot be supported or maintained. Also important and related to overconsumption is our rapid increase into the human population. We are growing at a very rapid rate, and it's difficult to supply natural resources, food, water, shelter to a lot of these populations. You're also seeing, again, a poor distribution of these human populations, so a large population growth in areas of the world that can't sustain it. In areas that can sustain population growth, we're not seeing as high growth rate. Some areas of Europe actually have negative growth rates. So how is that being managed globally has become an issue. Significant changes in land use patterns, as I talked about earlier, suburban sprawl, migration, changing water rain patterns is changing forest or where we plant crops. Also, a large demand for meat products has changed some of our land use from farming to more pasture land. All these and deforestation is also had a major impact on our land use. As a result of that and human population increase and migration, you're seeing a loss in biodiversity. There's not as many species or animal plants as there used to be. That's having downstream effect on local ecology systems. So all that leads to a scarcity of natural resources, particularly fewer natural resources in areas where there's high human populations, which causes further problems, and a lack of attention to these issues by the greater human society. All this had led to different international agreements and multilateral treaties that have been pushed and attempted over the last 45 years now, starting with the Global Environmental Summit, which was in Stockholm in 1972. This was developed by the United Nations. It's come together with 26 principles regarding the environment and development. Was the first document where a number of countries in the UN signed off on. More importantly, it led to the formation of the United Nations Environmental Program, NEP. They have since then done a lot of analysis and data reporting annually on the global environments. A lot of that data has led to other formation and been the backbone and provided most of the research for other types of treaties, such as the Kyoto Protocol, such as the Montreal Protocol, and other issues. So although it wasn't a big deal, it led to more established organizations and entities and data collection on how the environment was changing across the globe. The 1973, you had the International Trade of Endangered Species, This again set international law where you would not have the trade and selling of animals or wildflower or plants that were on the endangered species list. So this led to a decrease of hunting elephants to get their ivory tusk, things like this. This was the international agreement that established these norms. They haven't always been followed, but the planet as a whole has followed a lot of these rules and regulations, and so a lot of species that were on the endangered species list in the 1970s have managed to continue to thrive. About a decade later, you had the Vienna Protocol, which was the first step leading to the Montreal Protocol. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Montreal Protocol in detail when we talk about the atmosphere. This was agreements among countries to stop the production of the trade name was Freon. It's these chlorofluorocarbons that was degrading the atmosphere and leading to the ozone hole above South America. The Antarctica. So this is initially signed on by 40 countries. It's been revised and updated 8 times now, or 9 times, including about a week ago. It was renewed come out where they actually are now phasing out other refrigerants that causes harm to the environment. We'll talk again more about the Montreal Protocol later in this course. And then you had 1992 was a big year for the environment, probably the most important year for sustainability yet. You had the Earth Summit, which was in Rio de Janeiro. It was attended by 178 countries. All the major international companies were there. They started developing deals between companies and countries, agreements between countries, leading to some of the initial work that was later phased in, and later protocols to how to deal with the environment and how to incorporate more sustainability into everyday practices. Also in 92, you had the biological diversity, which deals with conservation issues. And again, one of the most important ones that come out of that was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was after the Earth Summits. This was the first deal broken dealing with global greenhouse gas emissions. It sets the UNCFC, the United Nations Framework for Conventions on Climate Change, hard to say, still exists today. It meets annually. This is the organization that developed the Kyoto Protocol. It also developed the Paris Agreement that was signed last year and went into action in October 2016, about a month ago, or less than a month ago. They established quotas for different countries on how much carbon emissions you should set for. This was in 1992. This was the initial framework where carbon credits were first introduced. We'll talk more about this again in this section on the atmosphere. But this became a big deal because it still exists today. A lot of these frameworks have developed with time. This framework that developed in 1992 later became known as the Kyoto Protocol. Also, so before I get to that, the Agenda 21 is a 21st century plan for sustainable development. Although this was put on and supported by the UN, it had some pretty harsh requirements. 21 was to say, what's our plan for sustainability for the 21st century? It was not well received, particularly by the industrialized countries. Many countries, including the U.S., felt that if Agenda 21 was implemented, it would lead to lower standard of living globally. It would also impose some sovereignty rights of different countries. So it didn't go far. So again, kind of an example of what not to do and how you can be too aggressive in sustainability efforts. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was one of the largest treaties signed among countries. 37 countries in the European Community, which was the forerunner to the European Union, ratified this protocol. The U.S. was a signature to it, but it was not ratified. Congress never ratified it, partly because of, again, it set higher protocols for developing, or higher standards for developing countries. Higher protocols for established countries than it did for developing countries. So, for example, the United States by the year 2000 had to stay at 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions, which went to a 7% reduction on a 3 to 5 year time period. There was many fear that would have negative impacts on the economy. Also, the fact that China and India had no compulsory requirements in the Kyoto Protocol because they were considered developing nations. So the greenhouse gas emissions of developing countries were a lot less than established industrial countries. So because of that, the Kyoto Protocol was never ratified by the Congress, and in 2011, Canada actually withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, as has a number of European countries. The big one has just recently happened. It was the Paris Agreement in 2015. It became ratified in October of 2016. It now means it is in force, and it takes effect on November 4th, 2016. It is the first comprehensive climate agreement aimed at the decreasing of greenhouse gases. The goals of the Paris agreements were threefold: to hold the increase in global temperatures below 2 degrees C, which is about 3 to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It was to increase the ability to adapt to adverse climate impacts. So when you see changes like the ozone depletion, it enables a series of different frameworks and international agreements to go into effect to prevent that. The big thing is provided financing on the global scale, kind of like the World Bank, for poor countries to adopt environmental, sustainable regulatory frameworks and provide funding for them so it doesn't hurt them financially or doesn't hurt their economy financially. And would also set limits on global greenhouse production. This is also called COP21. It is a very comprehensive agreement. It really, in my opinion, hasn't been well covered by the press. I'll send a link to it. It's pretty thorough, And now that since over half of the countries have ratified it, it becomes what's called in force. So the United States will have to agree with this going forward. Switching over to talk about water now. Many people have argued that the single greatest environmental impact piece of legislation has been the Clean Water Act of 1974. This deals with water pollution issues, which was a big deal in the U.S. in the early 1970s. It has over 60 sections. It is far-reaching. It deals with water runoff, sewage, wastewater, a whole number of issues. If you live in Omaha or been to Omaha lately or been in downtown or east of 72nd Street in Omaha, you notice the sewer separation project Omaha is going through. That is a result of the Clean Water Act in 1974. And every other city in the nation is actually doing the same activity, where they're separating their stormwater runoff from sewage water systems. They were typically built together in the early 1900s when cities were being developed and sewers were being installed. Now they have to be separated. Every city or town in the country is going through this, but this will lead to significantly better water quality and easier to manage. The Water Since Act was passed in 1977, and it allowed for local municipalities to monitor, collect taxes from industries that were using water. Before this, a large industry could put a pipe into a river and take as much water as they wanted with very little regulatory scheme. So because of that, particularly from power plants, the Water Since Act was passed to allow local municipalities or the EPA, if there is no local municipality, to regulate this water consumption, to take measurements and to impose taxes and fees on industries that were using large amounts of water. In 1981, the AIR Act was passed. It was similar to the Clean Water Act. The idea was to control air pollution, which for those of us old enough to remember, that was a big issue in the early 1980s. Acid rain was taking off. If you remember the Saturday Night Live skits, the rain in Maine was mostly from acid rain. That was out in 1982, and all the fears of acid rain led to the AIR Act in 1981. It established sanctions and authority, with your local authority having jurisdiction to empower these agencies to regulate air quality, both pollution, both in terms of monitoring and setting baselines, but as well as regulating companies or municipalities that were putting pollutions in air. So here in Nebraska, it is the Department of Environmental Quality is the authority having jurisdiction of any type of air pollution. In areas where there is no authority, the EPA can come in and set these limits. And also allow these local agencies to implement control measures to improve air quality. So in case the local smog got too bad, they could then implement policies to lower air pollution. Say if a summer afternoon with high levels of smog, then they could say, okay, nobody can run their power plants from 3 to 5 p.m. or whatever the case may be. That did happen a lot in mid to late 1980s. Caused a lot of discussion. And the Environmental Protection Act in 1986 kind of pulled everything under one umbrella, water, air, everything, and made EPA the regulatory agency. As most of the time, a lot of our statutes, local authority having jurisdiction will have this jurisdiction over the EPA. Complaints can be made that will cause the EPA to come in and investigate issues where a complaint is made. So the big thing about the Environmental Protection Act is that any citizen or anybody, doesn't even have to be a citizen, can make a complaint to Nebraska with the Department of Environmental Quality or the EPA, and by law they would have to investigate that complaint. So if someone were complaining about somebody polluting a company, polluting local water into a stream, or pumping out smelly exhaust, an individual in the community can make a complaint, and by law those agencies would have to investigate that complaint. So what's happening now in terms of how we manage these environmental protocols, and say if company X or firm X wanted to improve their environmental outlook, what would they do? Well, there's been a number of management systems developed over the last 2 decades. The most major one has been the ISO 14000. ISO is the International Organization for Standards. They have over 18,000 standards. I'm sure many of you in this class work in industry are familiar with their standards. They have a 9000 series which deals with total quality management. They have numerous other standards, usually regarding any type of industrial process, laboratory process, standards on how things are tested, all kinds of anything you can imagine. Well, the 14,000 series of ISO is an internationally agreed upon standard that sets out requirements for environmental management and improvements of environmental performance for a particular entity. Usually it's a company. So there's kind of 6 major parts of the ISO 14000. There's initially, if company or municipality X wanted to implement the ISO 14000 series, they would start off by having an independent third-party review called the Initial Environmental Review. That review would identify if any gaps in terms of things that entity is doing that is a gap that could be improved to improve their environmental impact. This is called a gap analysis. This is given back to the company. They can develop procedures and protocols on how to address these different gaps. And then there's a series of checklists and reviews, and company hires or appoints people as their environmental managers and overseers. And there's this whole series of steps and checklists to go through to lower the environmental impacts of a particular company due to a product or a process that they're making. And there's a series of PDCAs which cycle where you come up with a plan to decrease your environmental impact. You do it, you check it, you improve it. A whole series of standards looking at all of these. After a certain time period, the firm could, or the company could get a second third-party review on if they've improved by X or meet standard or meet the ISO criteria Y. Then they will become an ISO 14000 standard company or process. Here's for the 14,000, I've kind of broken them down here. You have some initial guidelines, principles, how you do labeling, how you perform performance evaluations, a series of standards of life cycle analysis, and product standards. I will post 2 of these on our website. The 1640 and I believe 1644 deal with the life cycle assessment, so you can kind of see exactly what is required. This ISO standard is completely voluntary. They won't tell you what goal the company was trying to achieve or how they achieved it. They'll just say whether or not they achieved it or not. So the marketing value of this is depends on the institution. There are certain industries and certain agencies within those industries that require these ISO standards are met. Others don't, so it depends on the industry and how they view these particular standards. Here's are some of the logos that different companies will make and put on their products or their marketing material. The one on the top left there is the ISO logo, and then the bottom four are different logos that companies have developed to show that they're ISO compliant. Let's look at sustainable engineering. So this is a graph, again, with looking at our definition of sustainability engineering, looking at society, which also include the environment, economics, and sustainability. This here is kind of our understanding of the field right now. Although this chart's a little old, it really hasn't improved much, which tells you just how young as an industry we are and how little we know about what we're doing. So again, the three pillars of sustainability, the environment, the economy, and social aspects. For a particular process to be sustainable, it should not cause irreversible change to the environment. It should be economically viable, and it should benefit society. So where those three circles intersect is where you have this sustainable process, product, or system. Where it's not all three, or maybe two of the three intersect, is where you may have economic and environmental benefits, not necessarily society benefits. An example of this is energy efficiency, renewable energies, energy systems that have low environmental impact. Where you have environmental sustainable impact, could be conservation policies, could be stewardship programs, whatever the case may be, but there may not be there may be a cost to it, not an economic benefit. Excuse me. Where you have society and economic benefits, such as fair trade, workers' benefits, may not be a directly correspondable environmental impact. So these are all good, but sustainability, we want to be at that intersection. So two things, again, we're dealing with society, economics, and the environment. And number three, from the simplicity of the graph, you can kind of see how we're still struggling with developing these ideas and these concepts. Again, it's a young industry, and we're still trying to figure out what we're doing. This is another way of looking at the previous graph, looking at it more from a triangle, where you have society on the lower left, the economy or economics on the lower right, and the environment at the top of the triangle. So again, right there in the center is where you can have all three, but that's difficult to get. Again, you need to separate needs and wants. You can got to allocate proper resources that are cost effective, but yet will benefit the environment. And you have to look at that societal impact as well. So we've been going for a while now, so let's take a little break. I want you to go look at this video by William McDonough. I mispronounced his name, sorry. If you Google Cradle to Cradle Design TED Talk, it will pop right up there. It's about a 20-minute TED Talk. He goes a bit off on a tangent at the beginning, kind of complaining on why aren't we doing things more sustainable. But in the second half of this video, he talks about some design steps he's implementing. He and his architectural firm is building an entire city in China. And that's the very interesting part of it, because we're talking about sustainable design. So go ahead, take a quick break, watch this video, and come back. Okay. Well, hopefully you enjoyed Those TED Talk. Again, he in 1992. So he was pretty much ahead of the curve here. He developed what's referred to as the Hanover Principles. These are 9 principles for sustainable design. So first is the insight on the rights of humanity and nature to coexist, looking for humanity and nature to both live together in the same space, healthy, supportive, diverse environments, both for humans and for the ecology, and be able to sustain and grow under these conditions. Second major principle is to recognize the interdependency of all these elements, both human and nature. They interact together and they depend on each other. Thirdly was the respect relationships between spirit and matter. It recognizes that there is environmental impact on dwelling and industry and how that affects the spiritual needs of both the earth and people. Fourthly was accept responsibility for the consequences of design. This is more focused on humans. We need to basically design things better that lead to better coexisting between humans and nature. Create safe objects for long-term value. Basically, point here was design simpler and for longer terms. So simple systems and buildings that can withstand the test of time. Eliminate waste as much as possible. Rely on the natural flow of energy. And by that, he's talking about looking at energy or water and how it flows. The sun, when the sun shines, how it warms up surfaces. That temperature heating leads to bioreactions in plants and trees. It also leads to warming up in humans, or warms up our buildings if we are using trimble walls and things like that, and how that energy flows through people and things. Understanding the limits of design. Nothing will last forever, so recognize that and design accordingly, and try to minimize its impact over the time, the length that it does naturally occur, and to always seek improvement. So these sound nice, but how on earth do you do them? So this is a model that was produced by Meadows in her book Thinking in Systems. I'll put the link up. You can probably find it. It's on Amazon. It's about a $12 book. It's not a bad book. Again, it's not very expensive. You don't have to buy it, but in terms of, she gives a lot of good examples on how to think in systems and how to design systems. So let's think about a tree. Okay, tree grows, the inflow of air and nutrients from the soil. They live, and you create a forest. And then how is that taken away? Well, trees die from natural death. They die from insects. They die from lightning strikes, all types of things. Or they can die by outside influences, such as logging. So if we were to take a systems approach to this, system engineering approach to how trees live, you would have inputs and outputs, and maybe you would have control valves on those inputs and outputs. So you're controlling the amount of natural resources that goes into that tree, how much rain it gets, what kind of soil it's growing in, what's the climate like, is it a cold climate or warm climate. Likely you can put control valves on the outputs of that tree. What are the outside forces that are causing the trees to die? Is it parasites? Well, can you do something to decrease the number of parasites? Is it pollution? Is it forest density? Is it too much lightning strikes? Is there too much logging activity? Well, what can change that? You can have market dynamic changes. You can have technological changes, disruption. You can have policy changes where maybe you're not allowed to log in certain areas. These are all the inputs and outputs that control your particular product here, which is the tree, and how these inputs and outputs have effect on that particular product. So now taking a step further, let's look at feedback loops, forward and reverse feedback loops. So let's take the parasites, for example. A lot of parasites in your area eating up the tree bark, causing a death in trees. Well, what kind of policies could be within that area that would decrease the parasites? Is there a lot of standing water? Can you get rid of standing water? Can you spray? Can you prevent any type of these? Can you encourage other species that eat the parasites? All those types of things action. Pollution effects on trees. Can we regulate pollution in the area? From the growth aspect, can you regulate lighting? Can you provide a better climate? Well, it's hard for a human to do, but those are all different control valves or feedback loops that can be set up to help control how the tree lives or doesn't live. So these are all sustainable activities that can be done to provide feedback loops that are ideally self-regulating, and so you wouldn't have to do anything to control these. And as we go through this class, looking at the 7 different resources, we're going to be examining the state of each resources and what type of controls, if any, and how do we set up feedback loops between that particular natural resource or human-made resource and a feedback loop so it can exist on its own with very little human input.